Thank you. Thank you. So as you can see, my name is Marko. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm glad to be here. I'm here to talk about scalable workflows for front-end development, and that's intentionally front-end development. Intentionally front-end development because front-end developers are becoming more common in teams. JavaScript ecosystem is evolving every day, and there's a lot of full-stack platforms that have even front-end developers working on them. Why am I talking about those? I'm a front-end architecture consultant. Basically, I turned myself into an entrepreneur, so I kind of see the both sides of the spectrum. You know, how it is to work in a team, how it is to work with another team, like someone else's team, right? When you're consulting, it's kind of different, and then having your own team is really important to figure out the other side. So I was told I needed really good icebreaker, so I brought this one. I don't know if that's gonna work. It's really like it's the first time I talk in Russian, so forgive me if I do something wrong. Basically, I travel around the world and I, teach people and talk to teams and startups and companies about how to improve their workflows and then how to improve their tooling with development. And generally, it's CSS. I write scalable CSS. I always encourage them to think about how it is to be future-proof, how that's going to scale up, what's going to happen with that. And the thing that you can see on the screen is what I do for hobby. I don't like flying, so whenever we fly, I tend to take these wing shots just to break it up a bit. Next thing, sorry. So I do a lot of open source work too. That's because I tend to figure out how it is in my projects when I do the stuff from scratch. And back home, we have a community that basically does the same thing that we came here to do today, talk about stuff, talk about workflows. I also founded a company back home. That's what I said. I have experience with the other side of the spectrum. It's an educational platform that wants to change the education full stack. And now I apply the same principles that I advise people to apply to their workflows. I apply that in my company. Okay, the major point of this talk is how to do more work and sit less in the office, which I think that everybody hates. And you can think of that as how do you think about artsy stuff and not trivial things? How do I spend less time thinking about things that I have to do every day? That's a huge thing when you're working with JavaScript, which is probably not nowadays. It's the most awful ecosystem there is because you have all of these things, and that's just half of the logos I could find. And you always think to yourself, am I stupid or incompetent because I don't know all of these things? It's usually like how developers tend to perceive this. Do I really need to know all of these things in order to do my job? And sometimes it makes you feel like this because when you look at those logos, and I tell you there are at least as many more, you don't know what's happening. And the problem is companies tend to do a lot of stuff, basically branded tooling. That's how I call it. So you often hear people saying, we should use React. And then you ask them why. And they say, Facebook made it. It's a common thing, right? We use Angular. Why? Google made it. And you always think of your team as like, what's the next thing that Google's gonna make that I'll have to learn, right? And the point with tooling and the things that you should use on your project is that you need to tailor everything. And you need to tailor that so it's tailored to your own needs. You need to solve your problem. And when I say plan the future, I always tend to say that you should plan for the apocalypse. If you start with a team of 5, think of your team as a team of 50. And you don't even know what kind of people those are. Always think about that, because if you think about that, you'll build a scalable workflow, right? And this first part of my talk is always about team dynamics. People always tend to forget that. Why do I care about team dynamics? I'll just use tools and that's gonna be fixed. But front-end ops are not the whole story. So you need to you need to streamline the whole process in order to have both team, like design, back end, front end, streamlined so they can understand the same workflow that you have. Okay, so the point I want to make is you can't look at front end development as an isolated unit. There's no way that's ever going to work, because front end developers get their tasks from designers basically. Even though you have a manager, you always end up with that guy that's doing design, and you ask yourself, what happened with this? What's this? What am I looking at the screen? And design and backend should be accountable. Remember that. Can I just quickly have a show of hands if you guys are front end developers? Is there like any front end developers in the audience? Okay, that's fair. But is there people that are managers in teams? Okay, more managers, nice. So you need to make your teams better. You need to make your teams better in a way that you tell your back-end developers and your designers that front-end developers are not those guys or gals at the team. They're going to do all the work, right? So basically, you have this life and death of a front-end developer, and that's usually something that you do. Every time I worked as a front-end developer, and every time I get a new team, it's always expected for me to do layouts, CSS, JavaScript behavior, JavaScript animations, all the browser things, and then back-end guys just finish everything they have. They wrap it up and just say, do the integrations yourself. And you expect the same person to do integrations, to do all those things. You have 3 different technologies, and you shouldn't do that, right? So the problem, starts with designers, and then you get something like this. You should really avoid uncodable designs. And when I say uncodable designs, I don't mean this. This is a pretty codable design. You can actually make this. What I mean by uncodable design, you can get a screen that looks perfectly nice as a PSD, for example, and then or in Sketch, right? And then when you try to make that in code with your CSS, with your layout tools, you see that something's wrong, something's off. Actually, everything is off because you haven't been on the same page with the designer in terms of scales. How big are the fonts? What are the colors? Do we have a brand? Do we have a style guide? Anything. And that happens more often than you think, right? So the way you can solve that problem actually is talk with your designers and establish toolkits. It doesn't matter if you use Illustrator, if you use Photoshop, if you use Sketch, any tool, just use toolkits. Make standardized components and use them all the time. So designers are kind of guys that want to do stuff arbitrarily. And when you do UIs or plan your websites, that's arbitrarily doesn't get you anywhere, right? And that's why I say, you definitely should have good style guides, and that improves consistency, right? And that's like the thing that I want to say is, if you have ground rules for everything, which is, you think it's kind of natural, but it's not, and you reflect them everywhere, you should really apply them everywhere that you can. And you have style guides. It's, you can't blame one person. It's always a team thing. The thing that's really important in nowadays JavaScript is you have to think about integrations as a separate thing. So if you have front end, which is HTML and JavaScript and CSS, and then you have back end, which is Node or something else, do the integrations separately. And I tell this to all of the managers. It's really improving and streamlining the whole workflow, and you get a lot of more value for your buck, right? You get tons of more value if you do integration separately. Don't expect a front-end developer to do the whole thing, to do HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and then integrate the whole API into that page. Do integration separately. So I just want to reiterate on that. Make designers accountable, prevent uncodable designs, and use style guides just in order to be consistent and to be on the same page with everyone in the team. The whole point of that is you need to minimize the friction. You need to minimize all those times when you have people arguing or if something is not going right. You need that principle that you want to make as a, in a style guide, in any kind of rule, you need that applied in practice, right? And all that in order for front-end developers to be artists. Front-end developers are really like peculiar people, and the whole position is peculiar because you're not actually coding. You don't need to know, algorithms and stuff. You do 3 different technologies nowadays that have completely nothing in common, and yet they work together somehow. No one knows how, right? And the consistency note is, no, this is not gonna play in a PSD. Okay, imagine it's CSS on the screen. CSS is probably gonna suffer the most because it's CSS, right? And in order for you to kind of prevent that from happening, establish naming conventions as soon as possible. Talk with your team, talk with your managers, and establish naming conventions in order for anyone to be able to jump in later on and just continue on your code, on your CSS, because CSS itself is not designed to do applications that we build nowadays, right? I guess that this is going to work now. Okay. So let's dive in the front end specifically. I'm talking about tooling, for example. What's the benefit of using tools? There's a whole movement that's called front-end ops. You've seen how many front-end frameworks there are in tools. You can imagine how much stuff you need to know in order for front-end ops to be a thing. And it's really wonderful when you look at it from someone's perspective. I don't like it, but it's really wonderful how many front-end tools you actually have, and how much you can do actually with not, you don't really have to think about a lot of things right now, because most of that is done for you. But there are concerns with using tools. Is the tool that you're using actually helping you? Are you just using it because Facebook or Google made it? There's a huge difference in that. People don't really think about that, but there's actually quite big of a difference, because if you're using something just because it's a brand, then you're getting into more technical debt that you can actually cope with later on, and that could be lethal for projects. I've seen that happen. So what do you really need to use? So I'm not going to talk about installing Grunt or Gulp, because most of you are not front-end developers, and that's not going to help even front-end developers. I'm going to talk about the workflows. So first of all, I hope that everybody are using code revision systems in their companies. It's 2015, so I hope that's true. But if you're using Git, there's this workflow established for Git that's called Git flow, right? It's just a fancy way of making your branches and your code revision much more effective, so you don't have defects in production, and so you don't have things like I didn't push this. That's not my commit. I don't know what happened. Why is this merge conflict happening? Just because you have, people tend to make excuses. That's why you need to make better tools to prevent that from happening, right? And I know that merge conflicts often appear when people are pushing into production, and that happens more often than you think, because the Git and generally release cycles are not something that you think, for example, in a startup or a small team, from the first day, right? But before you actually deploy to public, there's this local development, right? You do a lot of things locally. So with a lot of fragmentation, that becomes hard. You have a lot of tools. Most of those tools are not actually designed to work with each other. When you make something happen, when you build your code, you're not thinking to yourself, oh, that other guy that builds that cool tool that I use, should I make my program work with that? No, you don't think about that. You're solving a problem. So use things like this. This is a good example. Python has a module that's an HTTP server. You don't have to do, I don't know, Nginx or Apache. Just use this small tool, script it somehow to work automatically for you, and just use it. And something that people often forget in a team, you work with editors. So always have in mind that you need to augment your workflow in that way that you install good plugins. In JavaScript, Turn.js is a good example, right? When you use Sublime or Atom, which most people use, I don't know how many use WebStorm or complete IDEs, you need stuff like autocompletes, refactorings, hints, function arguments, stuff like that, like hooked into your actual documentation of project that you're building. So keep in mind that all of those tools, that they're just examples that I'm showing you. It's all about that mindset. The mindset is really important. If you think about how can I make my editor better? How can I make my Git branching better? You're always going to think about solving your problem and not just installing tools just because I told you so or Facebook or Google told you so. So another thing is when you're doing coding guides or style guides, it's really easy for a manager to say, you guys need to use 2 spaces for indentation. But can you really enforce that on a programmer? Can you really tell someone, okay, use 2 spaces, and I'm going to stand behind you and look at you all the time and see if you're actually doing it? That's why you have like JCSC is a good example of doing that automatically. You need to script everything basically. That's what I told you before. Be artists. Don't think about trivial things. And the rules are enforced best if they're automatic. Not even a manager is going to stand behind you all day. They have their work, I guess. What's important with package managers, a lot of them, I guess. There's NPM. People manage packages. What they really need to manage is dependencies. You can download any package. You can download Angular any way you want, but can you really update it that easily? The point of package management is so trivial that you shouldn't even consider it. You should consider managing dependencies. And there's NPM, there's Bower, there's Meteor has its own package manager and repo. And there are, tons of others. You can actually Google that and see there are like 50 of those. But they don't really emphasize, working with dependencies. Just don't fall into that trap of installing NPM to install Bower to install Angular, because that also creates a chaining of dependencies that it can create a huge mess later on. So what I wanna convey with this is you need to prevent fragmentation from happening, so you have more decoupled things as much as possible, right? Another thing that you probably know, and this is not a discussion about grunt versus gulp, is task runners. So anything that you have, you can automate using task runners. They have their own modules. And can I have a raise of hands if you use task runners in your project? Okay. So the stuff that I do with task runners, which would be really, really tedious if I did that manually, is compiling to ES5, compiling less the CSS, minifying CSS, compressing images, creating SVG sprites. At the end, all of these modules, when you process that automatically, that just event triggered, you have everything compressed, you have everything optimized for use. You can serve that. You have better performance with that, right? So the whole thing with tools is, again, you should use the tools that make most sense for your project. Don't use Angular. No, actually, don't use Angular. But anyway, it's important to note that you need to manage dependencies. You need to streamline your workflows in Git or any other code revision system. You need to think about scripting your own tools, using small tools as much as possible. You don't need huge infrastructure for trivial things. Think about local development really carefully. Don't prolong that. Don't sacrifice that in trying to make a better release cycle. It's really important to think about, because 80% of your time is spent in local development. The next thing that I'm going to show you is probably not the best slide, but this is how a task runner script looks like. And when you look at that, it's actually pretty easy for people to know what it does. But this is all the code that you need to convert less the CSS, auto-prefix your CSS, minify your CSS, rename it, then set it into its location for distribution. Minify the images, build SVG scripts, and then again, merge all of that, and just also have an event that waits for you to change anything, right? That's, I guess, like 30 lines of code, something like that. And you even compress images. You have the whole thing basically done for you, right? Why are not people using that right now? That's one of the things I wanted to answer. And I want the answer to that, but I don't know why that's happening. That's why I'm giving this talk. So just do yourselves and your teams a favor and use all these things. Solve your problems, script everything, so you don't have to think about these things. You can think about the art that you're creating when you're coding. You can actually solve problems that you're paid for, or you have the wish to solve. That's it. We have 5 more minutes. So if anybody has any questions, you can actually ask anything in Russian too. We have, yeah. It's at 5. Yeah. Yeah. Whichever works for you.
Скажите, пожалуйста, почему вы говорите Angular не использовать? Может быть, я что-то пропустил, но просто вот можете на этом остановиться?
Because can I answer in English? Is that okay? Because I've used Angular. The first major framework that I used with JavaScript is Angular, and the magicness that you get first time that you use it vanishes anytime. When you scale your application up, it's just gone. Adi Osmani, if you know who he is, he has this great image he posted on Twitter. It has a huge number of retweets. I saw that there. It's a magical unicorn that stabs you later on. Right?
Так все-таки я не очень понял, Bower использовать или не использовать, или только NPM использовать, или не использовать зависимости, которые работают через Bower?
Bower?
Yep.
Well, Bower is, of course, you can use it anywhere, right? You can use it on vanilla JavaScript projects. You can use it on Meteor projects. It depends on your needs. You should use package managers. The point is you shouldn't be using package managers for managing packages. You should use it for quick updating and upgrading your projects. So that's what when I say dependencies, that's what I mean. Stuff just gets updated, and you don't want legacy code in your project. So you need to think about that. How can I quickly update without breaking anything? And that's what package managers actually do pretty well. That's why you should use them. Anybody else? Okay, thanks. Thank you.